Okay, so hello and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. My name is Stuart Scott. I'm the AWS Content Director here at Cloud Academy. And today we're going to be focusing on Amazon Lightsail and how you can use this service to configure a highly available WordPress site. So Amazon Lightsail is it's an easy to use virtual private server. It offers everything you need to build an application or website with a cost-effective monthly plan. So we'll be looking at how to leverage Lightsail features to elevate your WordPress websites. Now on the panel with me here today, we're lucky to have Jerry Hargrove from AWS. He's an Amazon Lightsail developer advocate. So welcome to the webinar, Jerry. I really appreciate you joining me. How are you doing today?
Thanks, Stuart. Glad to be here. I am doing great. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. I'm looking forward to the presentation that you got for us today and how a high availability configuration is put together to help us minimize any downtime of our Lightsail solutions that we're using. Now, before I hand over to you, Jerry, to give us the agenda, I just want to let everyone know that this webinar is being recorded, and so you'll all receive a link to it as soon as it's been published. And also, if you do have any questions as we go throughout the session today, then please use the chat window and we'll get to as many of them as possible during the Q&A at the end. Okay, so let me hand it over to you, Jerry. Thank you.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. So as Stuart mentioned, I'm going to be talking about high availability and WordPress on Amazon Lightsail today. My name is Jerry Hargrove. I'm the Lightsail developer advocate at Amazon. And during today's talk, I'm going to cover three topics. The first will be just a brief introduction to Lightsail, maybe 5 minutes on just the high level features and functionality of Lightsail if you're not familiar with it. And then I'll spend about the same amount of time just talking about high availability in general. So we'll cover some terms so we're all on the same page and we're all talking about the same thing. And then I'll jump into the meat of this talk, which is how to achieve high availability on Amazon Lightsail for your WordPress instance. So with that, I think, at the end of this webinar, you'll have all the information that you need to achieve high availability on Lightsail yourself. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So Amazon Lightsail, let's talk for just a few minutes about it, what it is at a very high level. So Amazon Lightsail is, and Stuart mentioned this, a virtual private server or VPS. And Lightsail is really the easiest way to get started on AWS, whether you're a developer or you're a small business, a student, or you're just a user who's looking for a solution and wants to build on the cloud. Lightsail provides you with that. It provides you with the compute, storage, and networking capacity you need, and provides you with the capability to deploy and manage your websites and your web applications in the cloud. Now, what is Lightsail typically used for? It's ideal for simpler workloads, for quick deployments, for getting started on AWS. It's really designed to help you start small and then scale as you grow. Lightsail makes your projects easier to automatically configure, to get networking set up, to access securely. It really takes the guesswork out of launching servers in the cloud. And as I mentioned before, as your ideas grow, a Lightsail load balancer and other features can be added to help scale your application with you. And one of the great benefits of using Amazon Lightsail is AWS manages all of those cloud resources for you. It's really easy to get started on Lightsail, and it starts with choosing an instance plan, and that includes the CPU power associated with your Lightsail instance, the amount of memory that's available to you, and how much storage and transfer is available to you. And as you can see here on your screen, one of the things we really love about it is it provides really predictable pricing for you. So you can choose the most economical Lightsail instance and only be paying $3.50 a month for that instance. And if you need more, you can certainly scale up to the right on this screen and choose Lightsail instances with more power and more memory and more CPU for your applications. In addition to choosing the instance plan, you can also choose a blueprint. And in this case, you can choose from a variety of applications pre-configured that allow you to one-click launch your application or your developer stack. So simple operating systems are available, including Amazon Linux, Windows Server, Ubuntu, CentOS, and more. You can launch a vanilla Linux instance with just the operating system, and then install or configure your own applications, or you can pick a blueprint with a prepackaged application on it, like WordPress, like we're going to be talking about today. But you can also, as you can see on your screen here, there are, you can launch a LAMP stack or a Node.js stack or a variety of other applications, and we're adding to those as we go on. So Lightsail is more than just a virtual private server, though, and I want to make sure that I cover a couple of these real quickly. Lightsail provides a host of other features to help your experience grow with you. That includes databases. So if you want to launch a database for your application, you can do that. Content delivery network, CDN, you can do load balancers, and we'll talk about a couple of these. It also includes DNS management, and we recently launched the ability to run containers on Lightsail. And I'll talk more about a couple of these in a few minutes as they relate to HA. Amazon Lightsail provides these features to make it really easy for you to get started. But that doesn't mean you're limited to just those options. You can integrate your Lightsail project with some of the other 90+ services available on AWS through VPC Peering. So you can connect to your AWS account and use other services like DynamoDB or Elasticache, for example, and then you can manage those services through the AWS console and still keep the day-to-day management of Lightsail instances through the Lightsail console. In addition, Lightsail provides a clear upgrade path to EC2 as your cloud ideas grow. As I mentioned, Lightsail allows you to grow your application as you grow your business, and we understand that as your businesses grow, you may need to move to EC2. So we've provided a guided experience for you to do that. You take a quick snapshot of your instance, move the instance over to EC2, and then follow a step-by-step process or wizard through the Lightsail console to get up and running. As I mentioned, popular workloads on Lightsail include simple web apps. You can get a web application up and running very quickly in just a few clicks and in just a few minutes using LAMP stack or Node.js stack. It makes it really easy to get web applications online. You can also use Lightsail to run your open source or commercial software for your business. For example, you can really quickly launch your line of business software like storage or file sharing or backups or financial or accounting software and more. And one of my favorite use cases, and one that I use almost on a daily basis, is dev and test environments. With Lightsail, I can very quickly launch, for example, an Ubuntu instance, spin up a test environment in seconds, and create a dev sandbox or a test environment that lets me test without fear of breaking something in production. And then once I'm done, I can just real quickly destroy or stop that instance. So that's really it. That's a quick 5-minute introduction to Lightsail. There's a lot more to come. I'll talk more about sort of the meat of the webinar next, and that's high availability. So high availability, sort of in the context of what I'm going to be talking about today, I want to start with this definition so that we're all on the same page. When I speak of high availability, or you'll hear me refer to it as HA for short, I'm really talking about maximizing the uptime of, in the case of today's webinar, WordPress, or really the amount of time that users or customers can access WordPress, or conversely minimizing downtime. So if you're running a blog on WordPress, we're focusing on the amount of time that users are able to reach that blog and read those blog posts. But this is still somewhat subjective. So when I say high, your idea of high might be different than mine, or might be different than that of your neighbors. So let's look at some language for measuring availability. So this may be a familiar term with many of you. People typically talk in terms of nines of availability. How many nines of availability is your site? So this expresses system uptime as a percentage of the total time. So for example, if you look at this chart, 2 nines of availability down on the bottom left there, or 99% uptime, what that really means is you could have up to 87.6 hours of downtime per year, which sounds like a lot. 3 nines moving up the table on the left-hand side is just 8 3/4 hours of downtime per year. Moving up a little further, 4 nines is just short of an hour of downtime a year, and finally 5 nines is about 5 minutes of downtime a year. So ultimately, when we're talking about high availability, what your end users and customers really care about, though, is whether your site is available when they want it or need it. And at the same time, though, nines are this is a really easy shorthand way to talk about how reliable your system is. One thing to keep in mind as we're talking about HA and the amount of availability that we have and the number of nines that we have is more nines usually cost more money. So the question really becomes, what level of availability do you need? And that really depends on your particular use case and how your WordPress site is being used. If it's a personal family blog that you're running on WordPress, so maybe I'm hosting a family blog with images, then the amount of high availability that I need is probably not that great. I might be able to get by with 2 or 3 nines of availability. If it's down for a few hours, that's fine. My family isn't going to be, they're all focused here in, the continental US, and so they're not going to be looking at it, during the wee hours of the morning, so I'm okay if something happened then. But if you're running a small business or some other business critical systems, maybe health and safety environment, or you're part of some large enterprise scale systems, you probably need more nines than that. And some may need 5 nines of availability. One thing to be sure, though, is that regardless of where you land on that chart, achieving high availability for your WordPress application it's going to be a journey, an evolution instead of a one-time event. So you're likely not going to jump from 2 nines of availability to 5 nines of availability for your WordPress site. You're probably going to do it incrementally over time. And your HA needs, a year from now may differ from your HA needs today. So the number of nines you need today might not be the same as the number of nines tomorrow. Another term that I wanted to cover real quickly is just single point of failure. Single point of failure means, quite simply, it's a part of a system that if it fails, it would stop the entire system from working. So for example, since we're talking about WordPress, if your WordPress instance relies on a single database, it's considered a single point of failure. If that database fails, your system is likely going to be unusable when your customers go try to reach your website. It's not going to be there because it's not able to reach the database. So single points of failure are undesirable in any system that's looking to achieve some level of high availability or reliability, whether it's a business practice, a software application, or some industrial system. So another couple of terms that I'll cover real quickly here, and you'll hear me mention these a couple more times later on, and those are recovery point objective and recovery time objective, or RPO and RTO respectively. RTO, as you see on this chart on the right-hand side, it indicates how long your system will be down after some form of outage, and RPO indicates how much data might be lost. So I'll focus mainly on RTO today as it relates directly to high availability, but you'll see I also call out RPO as it's also important because it determines how much data could be lost as part of an outage. And as a matter of fact, I'll be using a more concise version of this diagram really to keep track of our progress while making WordPress more highly available. So with that, I've covered a real quick introduction to Lightsail, a quick overview of high availability, at least how I'm going to talk about it today. So at this point, I'll move on to the core of this talk, which is achieving high availability on WordPress on Lightsail. So when you launch a Lightsail instance, you get with it, as I mentioned, you use a blueprint to determine what's going to be running, and you get with that the underlying, processing power and storage and memory and bandwidth. You also get, among other things, a public IP address. So when you launch your Lightsail instance, with that public IP address, you can reach your Lightsail instance right away, and you can also set up DNS to point to that Lightsail instance. And that's a very common thing to do. Spin up a Lightsail instance, point DNS at it, configure your WordPress site, and off you go. So each time, in this case, I visit my WordPress site at www.example.com, they would be redirected by DNS to that public IP address that's provided by Lightsail. But what happens? This works great until something happens to my Lightsail instance, or I need to restart my Lightsail instance. And when a new Lightsail instance is started, even one that was recently stopped, it gets a new IP address. And this might be because there was an actual outage, something failed on your system, you installed a new plugin or a new piece of software or a library, and your Lightsail instance, the software stopped working, or it might be something as innocuous as you having to just stop and restart your instance to change bundles. You decide to scale up from that most economical bundle on the left-hand side of that chart, if you remember, to the next one up. Any of those events could cause your public IP address to change. And so let's look at what this actually means to us in terms of the number of steps that it would take to get that instance back up and available to your customers. So assuming you started with a bare bones Lightsail instance and simply pointed DNS at it, here's what you'd likely need to do. And obviously, your mileage is going to vary. I'm gonna be talking about just a generic case. It looks a little like this. Suppose your Lightsail instance fails and you need to restore it. You're going to launch a new Lightsail instance, pick a region like you did before, a capacity, a blueprint, and in our example, WordPress. Next, you'll configure your WordPress instance. This all looks exactly the same as when you initially configured it. Next, you'll reconfigure your WordPress instance. Maybe you'll install your theme, your favorite plugins, and you'll upload your content. How long this takes really depends on how much content you have and whether it's automatic or manual. Are you using an available plugin to help you do some of that? And finally, you'll need to update DNS. And this kind of goes back to my comment about public IPs on Lightsail. Each time you start a new Lightsail instance, it gets a new public IP address. And that's even if you just stop the instance and restart it. And it gets a new public IP address, and so you need to tell DNS to use the new IP address for the new instance and not the old instance. So the question is, how long does it take, for DNS to propagate? Let's look at some of the times, just some rough estimates here. So say, for example, we're relaunching an instance. It's going to take about maybe 10 minutes to launch the instance, probably less time than that. Maybe a couple hours or less to restore the content on the instance. And then updating DNS, it's probably not going to take a day, although I've seen it take many hours to update DNS. But regardless, during that period, while you were waiting for DNS to point to the new IP address, some users might still be directed at your old IP. They may have DNS cached locally or somewhere near their system, and so they're still pointing at that old IP address, which is now going to serve them up nothing. And some may get your new IP address. So you've really got a mix of things here. So let's talk about our recovery objectives in this particular case. So looking back, our real goal is in achieving high availability and looking at it from the perspective of restoring this instance, we can see that our RTO, or the recovery time objective, or the amount of time the system will be down, could potentially be on the order of days. So we want to work on that, and this seems like a really good place to start our quest for high availability, and that is sort of fixing this DNS propagation issue, and that's where I'm going to start. So assuming you need to start with you're starting with a bare bones instance, let's look at how to actually fix that. So because it seems like a good place to fix it, and I'm using air quotes around fix if you could see me, because we're really not going to fix the problem. We're going to avoid it altogether, and I'll show you how. It's very simple. So we're going to avoid the problem of DNS propagation times by using a static IP address, and this is such a simple solution. In our case, imagine on the diagram here on the left, imagine your first WordPress instance fails for whatever reason. You can bring up another one in its place very quickly, a matter of minutes or a short amount of time to recover all the instance, and then very quickly point the new static IP address at the new instance, and you're back up and running very quickly. So a Lightsail static IP address replaces the default public IP address of your instance, so that if you ever do change instances, you can simply reassign that static IP address at that new instance, and it's handled automatically for you. Static IP addresses are free. You don't need to pay for them, and you can, as I mentioned, assign and reassign them to instances. So this is really a simple solution to that problem. We've really solved the DNS issue with a static IP address. So if we go back to our scorecard, and we can see that we've solved that problem with a static IP address and reduced the RTO from effectively days, potentially days, while we were waiting for DNS to propagate, down to hours. So just by using a static IP address, and it's free. So that's a real quick fix for us. Let's turn our attention to the second task on the list, and that is restoring WordPress content. And remember, when I set the stage, I really set this WordPress site up without a lot of thought. I wasn't thinking about what I would do when or if something happened. I just needed to get it up and running as quickly as possible. And I was thinking about how to build it the first time, but not necessarily how to build it the second time. So really the question is, what can I do to speed up restoration of my WordPress instance and content? So instead of having to go in and manually restore this instance, or even use a plugin to restore this instance, what can I do? Well, I can use Lightsail Snapshots. So Lightsail Snapshots provide you with automatic daily backups of your Lightsail instances. So you specify the time of day. You may choose to do it at 2 a.m. in the morning. It doesn't affect the availability of your instance while this happens. Lightsail Snapshots are incremental backups. So the first time you do a backup of your Lightsail instance, you get a complete backup of that instance, and then each backup after that is incremental. So it includes only the things that have changed since the previous backups. And you get 7 automatic snapshots, so a week's worth of automatic snapshots. And this means that you can restore your Lightsail instance to any one of those 7 snapshots, so you effectively any point or any day within the last 7 days. So what does this mean? I don't have to rebuild my Lightsail instance or my WordPress instance from scratch. I can simply restore my WordPress instance to the most recent snapshot. So going back to our scorecard, we've previously reduced the RTO from potentially days down to hours with a static IP address. Now, with the use of Lightsail Snapshots, I can reduce that from hours down to minutes. And the number of minutes is really defined by how long it takes to start a new instance, based on that snapshot and reassign a static IP address. So it's not a very long amount of time. The other thing to note is that we now have a definition of our RPO for this instance. So as I mentioned earlier, the RPO for a a service defines how much data could potentially be lost. And so daily snapshots, daily Lightsail automated snapshots really mean in a worst case, we might lose 24 hours worth of data. So for example, if I'm running a blog and I do my snapshots, I scheduled my automated snapshots for 2 a.m. in the morning, someone comes in and adds a new blog entry that morning at 6 a.m. and I have a some form of outage at noon that requires me to restart the system, that means I could potentially lose that blog post that was put in at 6 a.m. or effectively anything back to the most recent snapshot that I restored to. So this actually may be fine for many, and this is what I use for my AWS Geek website. This was just great. I particularly because I didn't update it that often, maybe once a day or once every couple of days, and so I wouldn't lose much if there was any kind of outage. And for many of you, this might be fine for you. You might stop right here and call it good. And as a matter of fact, if you do nothing more than this, everyone who's listening to this webinar should implement at least these couple of steps. It's really easy and inexpensive way to get a significant improvement in availability for your WordPress instance on Lightsail. It's really easy. But for those of you who want to achieve higher levels of availability, let's go ahead and push on. I'm going to turn to sort of the next step of achieving high availability, and that's the Lightsail instance itself. But so we're down to the point where we have the next thing we can improve on is increasing or decreasing the amount of time it takes to launch a Lightsail instance. But instead of focusing on speeding up creation of the Lightsail instance, I'm going to solve this problem a little bit differently. Yes, we could try to automate it and speed that up, but we're just cutting from 10 minutes down to 5 minutes or 4 minutes. Let's try a different approach to this problem. So as it turns out, the key to high availability often comes in the form of redundancy. And like with sheep, the more you have, the less likely you are to notice if one goes missing. You can add more and more and more, and the more you have, the less likely you are to see that one out there in the middle goes missing. And the same is true for WordPress. If I have many WordPress instances running and handling traffic with the capacity to handle all of my customer requests, if a single WordPress instance within that group fails for some reason, the others can take up the slack until it's replaced. But unlike sheep, simply cloning a WordPress server to achieve high availability doesn't really work. And to see why, let's take a brief tour of WordPress internals. So when I think about WordPress, I really think about it like this. As you can see on the left-hand side of your screen, I kind of partition it into two sections. One section that of the application that doesn't change very often, that section in this chart that's above the dashed line, and the part that changes more frequently below the dashed line. In those sections, in the upper section, that includes the the web server, Apache or Nginx, the application itself, the PHP application, and those things. Below the line are the database and the file system. And the database stores a big chunk of the data that WordPress needs. For example, user account information and blog posts. But the file system also stores a portion of data. For example, anytime you upload a new image to your WordPress server, those images are stored on the file system. And then there are some things like themes and plugins where both the database and the file system store information. So for example, the database holds information on what plugins and which theme is currently active, but the file system stores the actual code for themes and plugins. So to see what would happen if you just cloned a WordPress instance, let's walk through sort of a typical interaction with WordPress. So suppose someone publishes a new article to WordPress, and you have a single WordPress instance that's handling that. So here they publish the blog and they upload a new image. The blog information goes into the database, and that image is pushed over to the file system. Later on, if someone wants to read the blog, then if they'll follow a similar path, right? They go to that single WordPress instance, they read the blog information from the database and the image from the file system. But what happens if we just naively add another WordPress instance to the mix in our goal to achieve higher availability? So it might seem to work at first. You will definitely have to use a load balancer in place. Maybe there's some instance affinity. So if one user comes in and writes a blog post and then they go back in and try to read it, they'll be directed to the same WordPress instance and get the data that they're looking for. But what if instance A is busy and the load balancer routes users to instance B, or it's a new user and they randomly get routed to instance B? So the blog post and those images aren't there. That's because each WordPress instance is configured to use its own local database. And so if you spin up a Lightsail WordPress instance using the WordPress database, its default configuration is to use the local database. So if we simply clone that, it's not going to work. So I think you see what I'm getting at here, that this isn't strictly a high availability problem, but in this case, it's rather a shared resource problem. But we're going to have to solve this shared resource problem before we can achieve higher availability for our system beyond what we've already done with a static IP address and Lightsail automated snapshots. And as I inferred, before with the sheep, the solution to this problem is the use of shared resources like database and file system. So ultimately, what we'd like to see is something like this, where we can add multiple instances, put them behind some form of load balancer, and they all get their data from one single source of truth, a single database or a single shared file system. So let's go back to our WordPress internals chart and take a look at it here. So revisiting this diagram, let's start by moving the database so we can share it between WordPress instances like this. The solution to this is to use an external database instead of the local database, and to configure instances to use that external database. And many of you who've worked with WordPress or other LAMP stacks are probably familiar with this. You simply spin up another instance with a database on it, and you configure all of your WordPress instances to use that database. And luckily, we can use a Lightsail database to do exactly the same thing. So Lightsail databases are fully managed databases, Postgres or MySQL. They're highly available, and they come with automatic failover. So you have a primary and a secondary instance. If traffic is routed to the primary instance, if there's ever a problem with the primary instance, Lightsail databases will automatically fail over to the secondary instance and initiate recovery of the primary. Lightsail databases also come with automated backups, and that includes 7-day, 5-minute point-in-time recovery. So you can recover to any 5-minute increment over the course of the last 7 days. So when we're using Lightsail WordPress instances, how do they use this new database? So changing the database is easy as simply updating the configuration system. So using a Lightsail database allows us to share this resource across multiple instances. But what does this do for us in terms of HA? In terms of HA, it really doesn't reduce RTO. It gets us, it's a necessary requirement for achieving HA later on, but in and of itself doesn't provide us with HA. But what it does do is it helps us improve our RPO significantly. So with instead of having to go back 24 hours, we can really leverage that point-in-time recovery made available by Lightsail Databases and recover to any point in time within the last 7 days. You know, the best case, that could be just 5 minutes ago. So we've effectively reduced our RPO, or the amount of potential data loss, from 24 hours down to 5 minutes. Now, there are some caveats here, right? We're going to be using a shared file system, and we'll have to we'll need to synchronize recovery points between the database and the file system, but in theory, we could reduce it down to this point. So let's go back to our WordPress internals, and now that we've shared the database, let's look at sharing the file system. So I'm going to further partition the file system, as I did previously, to the whole system. Looking at it in terms of what changes frequently and what doesn't change. I'm going to further partition the file system into parts that are updated infrequently, and like themes and plugins, so we tend not to update those as often as database entries, for example, and parts that are updated frequently, content and uploads. So this allows us to deal specifically with this use case. Now, there are other techniques that I'll leave for another talk on managing updates around plugins and themes, but it gets a little more involved. But to solve this particular use case, we're going to want to share content, and in particular, those uploaded images, for example, that are, and other things that are associated with our blog posts. To solve this particular use case, we can use a combination of things. And the first is the use of Amazon S3. So we can use Amazon S3 to act as our shared file system, if you will. S3 provides a cloud object storage. Many of you may be familiar with it. It's fully managed, highly available, and highly durable cloud storage. We can use that to share all of our media files, for example. So in addition to that, it wouldn't solve the entire problem. We need to use a third-party plugin like W3 Total Cache or WP Offload Media Lite. And many of you are probably familiar with W3 Total Cache. It's a much more comprehensive plugin. It doesn't solve just this particular problem, but does a lot of other things around performance and caching and the use of CDNs. But for this particular use case, we're looking at these plugins to automatically copy images and videos and documents and any other media added through WordPress's media uploader to Amazon S3, and then automatically replace the URL to each of those media files with their Amazon S3 URL. And also do this for things like image thumbnails. So the combination of S3 and a plugin, we effectively have a shared file system for our system to use. So if we go back to our WP internals and we look at, we move the database out and a portion of the file system out, and now we have a system that looks more like this on the right-hand side, where a user can publish a blog post, can write to the database, can upload images to the file system, and then that same user or another user can read those same images going through a different instance. So we're starting to set ourselves up to become more highly available, but the last step in this is a load balancer, so we can use multiple instances. And as you might guess, I'm going to suggest that we use a Lightsail load balancer for this. So Lightsail load balancers are fully managed load balancers that provide automatic health checks, free SSL certs, very predictable pricing, just like Lightsail Instance. Allows you to attach and detach instances very easily. In the event one instance becomes unhealthy, the load balancer will remove it from rotation until it's healthy again. And it also helps with achieving not only a much more highly available system, but the use of a load balancer also provides you with much more scalability. So for example, if you have if you expect a lot of traffic for a particular event, your own Black Friday on your WordPress site, you can add new Lightsail instances in preparation for that event, let them handle the increased traffic on the day of the event, and then remove those instances once the event is over, and no longer have to pay for them. All right, so with the addition of a load balancer, now we go back to our our road to high availability, and we start to see what this complete solution looks like here. So to really review this last section, we added a Lightsail database, which didn't solve the HA problem specifically, but did significantly improve our RPO. And then when used in concert with Amazon S3 and a plugin to share resources and a Lightsail load balancer, we can see that the impact on RTO, reducing what was days to minutes and now potentially seconds in this case. If you have a single WordPress instance fail, you will always have another one there that can handle the traffic, and depending on the amount of high availability you require, you may have multiple instances there. So any single one of those instances failing won't significantly impact the availability of your system. So with that, let's review where we've been. So we started on this road to high availability, and we were looking at it from the perspective of really RTO and to some extent RPO, recovery time objective. How do we minimize the amount of time our system is down? How do we maximize the amount of time that our system is up and available for our customers to use it? So we started with a Lightsail static IP address, and a Lightsail static IP address really helped us with DNS. So we no longer had to worry about changing IP addresses and updating our DNS and waiting for those IP addresses to propagate around the world so our customers could find our WordPress site after some sort of outage. And we reduced our RPO down to effectively hours at that point, really the amount of time that it took for us to then rebuild our system from scratch. And then we solved that problem, rebuilding our system from scratch, by introducing the use of Lightsail Snapshots. With Lightsail Snapshots, they allow us to recover our system from a point in time over the last 7 days. So and reduced our RTO then down to minutes, and helped us define what our RPO was. Now it's 24 hours. So at the most, given a system outage for our WordPress instance, we might possibly lose 24 hours worth of data. And as I mentioned, this is a place where many of us might stop. That's, we add a static IP address and add snapshots, and for our hobby site or our family site, this is sufficient, and it's inexpensive and easy to implement. But for those who wanted to achieve higher levels of availability, we then went on and talked about the use of a Lightsail database. Lightsail databases are, as I mentioned, fully managed, highly available databases that allow us to achieve higher levels of RPO. So we now move from days down to minutes in terms of the RPO for our system using point-in-time recovery. With the Lightsail database, after we added that, then we added a combination of Amazon S3 and a third-party plugin to implement a shared file system that allowed us to reduce our recovery time objective down to just minutes. We've effectively shared the database, we've effectively shared the file system, and the amount of time to recover is really just the amount of time to spin up a new instance based on a Lightsail snapshot. And finally, we added a Lightsail load balancer. Lightsail load balancers allow us to add multiple instances, add some redundancy to our Lightsail instances, our WordPress instances, such that if any single WordPress instance were to fail, that there would be others in the background waiting for them to take up the slack for those Lightsail instances that failed. So with that, you've now effectively reduced your RTO down to you've minimized it such that in the best possible case, even if a Lightsail instance does fail, your end users are no longer impacted by it. So that's really the path that we wanted to take today. But there's actually more. Those are the first steps. As I mentioned, the road to high availability is very often an evolutionary process and accomplished in multiple steps. So your first step may be to simply add a static IP address and use Lightsail Snapshots, and your second step might be to use a shared database and file system and load balancers. But there are other things that we don't have time to talk about today, but could take up additional talks. And one of those is through the use of a CDN or Lightsail CDN specifically. You can move your data closer to your end users, utilize other AWS resources like Lightsail CDN to cache your data out at the edge of the network closer to your users to further reduce or to make your system more highly available and use some of the high availability that's inherent in other AWS services. I didn't mention the use of elastic file system. So in terms of a shared file system for WordPress, I chose to go the route of S3 and a plugin, but you have other options available for you on AWS. You could use elastic file system and simply mount an NFS file system on your WordPress instances and accomplish the same thing. The third item, I briefly mentioned this, instance administration. So looking at, our shared file system really helps us in the case of media files like images and such that are uploaded with blog posts, for example. But what happens when you need to update a theme or you need to update a plugin or add a plugin? How do you do that? How do you deploy that across those multiple WordPress instances that are now attached to a load balancer? So there's some more detail that could be discussed there. And right-sizing instances, as you add more instances to a load balancer, suppose you initially started with one large instance and you used a load balancer and you split that into two medium instances. Is that the right approach to take, or should you use 4 small instances, for example? What are the benefits? What are the advantages and disadvantages of going one direction or another? How do you choose the right-sized instance based on your high availability needs? And then finally, is graduating to EC2. For some, they will continue to grow and continue to look for features and capabilities that might be available on EC2. At what point do you decide to migrate your WordPress stack from Lightsail to EC2? There's a whole lot of detail there that would be interesting to cover in another talk. So with that, I will go ahead and finish up. I want to thank everybody who joined us today. On your screen, you'll see a QR code. If you want to take a quick snap of that, you can get some AWS credits that allow you to go out and experiment with AWS and try out Lightsail specifically. I want to thank everybody for joining me today. And I think at this point, if we have any questions, I'm happy to field questions and talk for a few more minutes.
Yeah, we've got a number of questions that come in, Jerry. Thanks very much for that presentation. That was great. With some really good information there, and looks like there's potentially some more talks going forward as well, looking at that last slide. So if I just read out a couple of questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
So we had a question come in here. Says, you mentioned virtual private servers. Can you explain how that is different from virtual machines?
Yeah, so when we're talking about virtual machines, we're on AWS, we're really thinking about EC2. And when you launch, for example, an EC2 instance on AWS, you're really getting that virtual machine. You get to decide on the Amazon machine image you're going to use with that, but then you're responsible for installing the software, for managing the instance itself, for setting up security groups and placing instances in availability zones, etc. With virtual private servers and specifically Lightsail, you get all of that packaged into a bundle. And so it's very predictable, it's very easy to use. So in our case, for example, WordPress, we really just want a WordPress instance to be spun up that we can very quickly access and very quickly use and make available to our customers. And I don't necessarily want to, I don't want to deal with all of the underlying infrastructure or administer all the details associated with it. I want Amazon or AWS to handle that for me. And so that's what our, what Lightsail is and what a virtual private server is using Lightsail. You get all of that with you. You get bundled CPU, you get bundled network transfer, all in one, as well as default security associated with it. So you don't have to deal with any of that.
Helps take some of the legwork out.
It takes a lot of the legwork out. And as I mentioned, it's one of my, my go-to, Lightsail is my go-to for dev and test environments for me, because I can simply fire up or start a Lightsail instance and in a matter of minutes be able to SSH into it or use Visual Studio Code and connect directly to it very easily. I don't have to I don't need to set up, security groups, and I don't need to use proxies or Bastion hosts to access my instance.
Excellent. Okay, next question. Thank you for that. Can we extend the snapshot retention on the automatic retention Lightsail feature? It only covers 7 days of retention.
Right, that's a great question. And I covered automated snapshots specifically, but you can also do manual snapshots. And so you can go in. So talking about automated snapshots, just a little more detail. So they provide you with a whole lot of bang for the buck, I think. You have to pay there's a storage fee for those snapshots, but it happens automatically for you. If you stop that instance though, that automated snapshot, or I'm sorry, not if you stop the instance, if you delete that instance, those snapshots go away. And so you can start using manual snapshots. And manual snapshots, well, they solve 2 problems. Number one is really to solve the question that you asked is how do you extend automated snapshots? You do that through manual snapshots. That's really the only way. But it also means that when if you terminate that instance, those manual snapshots are still available to you later on to spin up new instances. Now, that means you would then be responsible for going in and determining when to do those manual snapshots, how many of them to keep around, how, and when to prune those away when you no longer needed them.
Just a question on that. Do you get prompted when you do terminate the instance if you want to take a manual snapshot? I know you get that option on one of the database services. I can't remember if it's RDS or DynamoDB, but you get the chance to do a manual snapshot before you delete it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Cool. We've had another question. What are the main limitations of Lightsail?
Well,
I'm not sure if they're talking about kind of CPU usage or kind of higher.
Well, I don't see them as limitations. So Lightsail provides some conveniences and some abstractions over, if you compare, say, for example, Lightsail instance to an EC2 instance, Lightsail has encapsulated a lot of the sort of normal defaults that people are using. So if, say, for example, you were going to go in and launch a WordPress instance on EC2, Lightsail abstracts much of that away from you and allows you to very easily just get to the application itself and not have to worry about the infrastructure underneath it. Now, having said that, what that really means is you don't have access to all of the knobs and buttons that you would on EC2. As I mentioned before, security groups, auto scaling, features like that aren't available on Lightsail. And it's intentional, right? We provide this very simple, easy to use, very predictably priced experience with VPS servers. If you need access to that functionality, we also provide a very easy migration path or evolution path to EC2 if you want. So I don't really see them as limitations. I see them as sort of guardrails that if you once you decide that you no longer need those guardrails, you can take those guardrails off by migrating over to EC2.
Excellent, thank you. Can Lightsail be configured to leverage all other AWS services, both regional and global?
Yeah, so you can access AWS services through Lightsail using VPC peering. And so if you can access a particular service through a VPC peer, then you can access it from your Lightsail instance. When you use VPC peering, what you're effectively doing is peering the VPC that your Lightsail instances are in to a VPC in your AWS account. So if you might choose a particular region, that VPC peer would be associated with the default VPC in that region, and then through that VPC peer connection, you can connect to AWS resources that expose themselves in that VPC in another region. And I've done that with, for example, Elastic File System, DynamoDB, S3 endpoints, for example. All of those can be accessed through that VPC peer. So that's the most popular way, or probably the best way of accessing other AWS services is through that VPC peer. And we provide you can go through the Lightsail console and create that VPC peering connection, and then use the the service console for whatever service you have or are interested in using to configure and access that.
Okay, excellent. I think we've got time for one more question. Does Lightsail instances support CPU credits to burst CPU utilization?
Yeah, if you look at the Lightsail instances themselves, they are burstable instances, and so they're meant, as I mentioned, for specific workloads like websites where you expect to receive bursts of traffic that you can accommodate using those burstable instance types, and then accumulate some of those credits when that traffic's not there. So if you think about like T2 instance types on EC2 or T3 instance types on EC2, very similar to that.
Excellent. Thank you very much for going through those questions, Jerry. So we're coming up to the top of the hour now. So again, I just want to thank you all for joining us today, and a special thanks to Jerry for a great presentation. It was really interesting to hear about how Lightsail can be really easily configured to support WordPress in a highly valuable deployment, especially overcoming the DNS and restoration issues you mentioned, and with the ability to set up shared resources as well. We've had some good interest coming in from the audience, so thank you all for your great questions today. It's certainly given us all something to think about and to take away from today as well. Just as a reminder, everyone will receive the recording via email as soon as it's available. And don't forget to check out all our other webinars as well, which you can find on our website at cloudacademy.com. So once again, thank you, Jerry. Do you have any closing remarks before we go?
No, thank you, Stuart. I'm happy to be here. If anybody has any additional questions, you can reach me on Twitter. I'm AWS Geek on Twitter. Feel free to hit me up there and let me know what your experience is on Lightsail, and especially what your HA path looks like. Happy to answer questions and help out where I can.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And hopefully we can do some more of these going forward, touching on some of those other topics. That would be great. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Jerry, and goodbye. Thank you.